So, questions? Yeah. Well,
I have a really quick one of the last speaker. Will your show on logo be online? Will you have, so that we can view it?
Pardon?
You're going to do a show on logo?
Yes.
And will that be online? Will it be on the internet so that we can view it? Because it looks very interesting.
Yes, there are some ceramics of Leuger in the internet on the homepage of the Badisches Landesmuseum. Yes.
And will you have the show?
But there will be an exposition catalogue.
When is it the exhibition?
It begins in 28th of June, in a few weeks.
Rebecca mentioned earlier, whoops, I'm sorry, I apologize. Rebecca mentioned earlier this morning that Majolica was phased out in part because of the toxicity of lead glazing and also the demand for, I think that's right, for the product. How long did lead glazing go in the factories that the three of you referred to? Did it,
Lead glazing, Rorstrand stops making Majolica in about 1908, but at Gustavsberg, you can still find some pieces in their catalogs as late as about 1912. So they must have they must have continued for a while.
sorry.
Yeah.
Question for Dr. Weber. Do you have any sense from looking at Gustavsberg Majolica what proportion of it was marked? Because you've shown several pieces that seasoned collectors would look at and swear they're English.
All the pieces that I've showed you are marked.
Right.
And in fact, when Joan Stack I showed her some photographs I had on my iPhone when I first came back from Sweden. She said to me, "Those are not Swedish pieces, those are Minton." And I said, "No, they're marked." She couldn't believe it until I showed her some of the photographs and the marks. They're extremely close, but remember that they were importing wholesale workers, patterns, molds, and there's no patents at this time, so everyone's freely copying.
Why did the factory start so late in Germany doing this work when everybody has talked about how there was a decline in the other countries? Does it have anything to do with the reunification of the country? I'm trying to figure out why it started at the very, very end of the 19th century and then went into the 20th century.
Oh, it was the idea of Jugendstil to make the own production of ceramic in his own country better, and it was manufactured. It was not an industry. It was very important. It was part of the idea of Jugendstil. But the Majolica manufactory in Karlsruhe was the first of the beginning 20th century who began.
So it's really the beginning of modernism in Germany, which is very different from our connotations of historical Majolica, right? Even though it says Majolica manufactory, what you're suggesting is that it is, in Germany at least, the beginning of a modernist movement. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Except that there was German Majolica made by companies such as Lonitz
And Schiller.
and Schiller,
Our
very
citizen-
much in the Victorian tradition that look as if they're not modernist at all, and I believe they're probably not. I think this kind of gets to the I'm thinking of the wine cooler. I guess it's a wine cooler with the grape leaves and the putti. You know, the 8 putti.
Fruit bowl. This was
Yeah.
a fruit bowl.
Yeah. I thought because they were grapes, I thought it might be for a wine bottle. There's a very specific look to those putti that does not look like any
Yes.
other group of
Yes.
putti
Exactly.
anywhere.
Sure.
And I'm sure that's deliberate. And I'm sure, or I have the instinct, that that's got something to do with the modernist, natural, I can't quite put my fingers on it, but there's something modern looking about it. But did you say when they stopped making that particular style of wares with those cheerful little babies dancing around?
With the beginning of the First World War.
Okay, so anytime I
But
run across one-
they were produced until the 20s.
Okay, all right. So, but there is a end date.
Yes,
Okay,
yes, you
right.
can say.
1920s. Okay, thank you.
Did Leutner produce after the war? I mean, did he, or when did he die? Was he able to go back into practice?
Max Leuer?
Yeah, at the end of the Second World War.
Max Leuer?
Yeah,
He died in 1952.
in 52. Yeah, and so during the war years, what was his activity? Was he able to produce?
During the First World War, he founded his workshop in 1916,
Yeah,
and he began, and the First World War was no thing for him.
But you said that with the rise of the Nazis in
Yes.
33, between 33 and his death,
Yes.
what did he do? Did he like, I don't know, like Emil Nolde, did he produce in isolation, or yeah.
He produced always in isolation.
Yeah.
This was his wish, because he was an own personality, and he wanted to be free of market and producers, so he wanted his own workshop.
Ah.
And he wanted to make these things with his own hands.
For sure.
A true artist.
Yes.
A wealthy true artist, maybe.
Yeah.
Catherine.
Yeah, these papers, as well as others, have brought out these really interesting tensions between internationalism, nationalism, and cosmopolitanism, both sort of in style and form. And I'm really wondering if you can comment specifically about markets, the markets you see for this, specifically the things you were talking about, but even in general. So regional versus national versus international. How do you see these fitting together?
Well, at first, the Swedish factories produced just for their growing local populations. And remember that Sweden and all the other countries were all connected for a while. And in fact, Rörstrand, wanting to enter the Russian market, had a company called Arabia, which with its headquarters in Denmark, and that was how they were able to have the Danish market as well as be able to sell to the Russian market. And as they expanded, they had traveling salesmen who took their wares to America, to Germany, to France, to England, and they increased their export market. But all of these countries participated, as you know, in the international fairs. And what you tried to accomplish in the fairs was a national identity. You wanted to be proud of what was happening in your country. So you wanted to have a product that had a singular sort of idiom. And I would love to learn more, frankly, about the old Nordic style in Sweden. And what's also interesting, that once you were going to market in the bigger international arena, particularly in some of the fairs, you had to have a stamp that said "Made in Sweden" in English, because there was a protectionism about your own industries and about not wanting to buy foreign goods. So they were very aware of growing markets, the importance of having international sales, and also having their own, particularly in Scandinavian countries, their own identity.
From the Zsolnay factory, most of the decorated ceramics was exported. Yes.
How broadly exported?
In France, and for example in New York too. It was very important, the World Exhibition in the history of the Zsolnay factory. And after the World Exhibition, it was always very successful, this decorated ceramics. And they can more and more produce.
Because remember that the centers of the art world were Paris in those years, London, Paris. You know, it's only after World War II that the center of the art world is going to move to America. So it was very important to have and be appropriate in these European markets particularly.
But to your point, Catherine, I like the distinction you made between nationalism and cosmopolitanism. And I thought, it struck me looking at some of those pine cone pieces, for instance. They would appeal, obviously, to a local audience, you know, as something familiar. But would they necessarily carry a nationalistic connotation? Were they marketed abroad, as it were, or sold at the exhibitions with that kind of meaning? Or were they simply, you know, pleasant reminders of the familiar?
I think they were part of the bigger sort of romantic rural tradition that was happening in Sweden with Carl Larsson and wanting to, you know, get back to your rural roots and back to the land as everyone was moving to the cities to get factory jobs.
Sure.
And so there was now a new appreciation again of the rural traditions of Sweden.
Right. Because in Hungary at this time there is this express desire to create a national patrimony, isn't there?
Yes, because it was a Hungarian-Austrian monarchy.
Exactly.
And in this situation, it was very important to express the Hungarian identity, cultural identity. So,
so I think one can make these
and
distinctions.
I think there was in the 19th century parallel globalism and nationalism. It was together. It was the two part of one thing, the modernism.
Yes. Right. Well, we've seen an extraordinary, I think, development of techniques in the last three lectures. Of this idea of ceramic plaques painted to look like photographs, and then seeing actually photographic techniques applied to photographs, and it's an interesting development, if you like, of what's happening right at the end of the century, and perhaps this experimentation itself leads to the ultimate decline of the classic Majolica as we've seen it at the high Victorian era. But it is worth speculating, and I put it to the speakers and to everybody really. Why do we think it declined ultimately, and why was it never reinvented? It comes back obviously in this different modernist manifestation, but in a form that is so completely different.
Could I ask you whether how prevalent it was, the knowledge in England of the lead glazes and that it was killing all the factory workers, or did that come out later?
No, it came. It was a problem, a recognised social problem, as the workforce became more regulated in the late 19th century. and parliamentary commissions were set up to investigate the conditions of workers and so forth. And I quoted from an 1898 commission into the issue of lead poisoning. It was a kind of national thing by Fernwell. And I think from that moment on, actually before that, it precedes that, there's a desire to develop leadless glazes. But they continued to be made well into the 1930s, 40s in England. Yes?
To go back to your question about why things changed,
Yeah.
I was just thinking about German Expressionism.
Could you speak a little louder? I can't hear you.
I was just thinking about German Expressionist painting and how large a theme it was, the destruction of World War I, not yet anticipating World War II yet. And most of the Western world felt that it was such an apocalypse. They had to reinvent everything, including national ethos. And all different kinds of art groups found different ways of turning away from what they perceived to have caused this horrendous event. And what we've been saying today, I mean, just in the last few minutes, is two countries' responses to that kind of philosophical pressure. And the Bauhaus was also part of that. And as you said earlier, somebody said earlier, one of those movements was going to take hold. But they all, as everybody has said, rejected what the grandparents and the parents had, but partly I think because there was a sentiment that those people were to blame for what had happened. Oh, I'm sorry.
I think you also had the movement away from the factory, and you had the development of the studio potter, the individual who makes and produces, and that really began to take root at the turn of the century. Adelaide Alsop Robineau in the United States, and Binns, who came to the art potteries from the UK. We have that history evolving at the end of the 19th into the 20th, and by the time of the First World War, we have serious studio potters setting up in the United States who continue on to today. So, and not only in the United States, it was also Europe, the UK, and certainly Germany. I think that there was a natural movement as you begin to experiment more. People who are working begin to see creativity expressed.
Well, it's a natural sort of growth of the arts and crafts movement.
Exactly.
I mean, those seeds are planted,
That's right.
and they really sort of takes,
It was
sprout.
development.
Yeah.
But it
Good night.
also has nothing to do with tableware. And a lot of Majolica of the Victorian period was based around the dining room and food.
I think that's a very important point, that we tend to see this opposition between Majolica and then arts and crafts as though one is reacting to the other, but is it necessarily true? Not necessarily, I mean, yeah. Yes, behind the lady behind, yeah.
I'm sort of going out on a limb on this, but just a safe statement, it's multifaceted what causes change, but I was thinking of an analogy with the containers for snuff and the use of snuff. And initially they were, crystal and gilded and wonderful creations, and then when snuff was a statement about your status in society. And then as time went on and snuff was used by the masses, and the containers that it was used in became not so wonderful, and then they became little things made out of toothpicks or whatever. I could see the decline in terms of the manufacturing, lesser manufacturers making these things and becoming very gaudy rather than mint and quality and all of that. So I'm looking at the decline of the manufacturing of it and the uses by the masses, and then it becomes not so interesting to some people.
Yeah. And the gentleman.
To take off on what you're saying, I think that if we look at Majolica as being produced in the midst of the early industrialization, and then, you know, the past 100 years, the rate, if you really look at the rate at which things have changed in general, okay, everything has change has sped up considerably to the point where today it's almost too fast. And I'm wondering if, you know, in terms of the mass production and the new techniques, and also the fact of the advertising and the whole point of advertising is to get people to buy something new, okay, and fresh, okay? And as soon as something is considered old, whether it's good or not, you want to get what's new, and it's going to be there, okay? It's going to be there, whether it's good or bad, and they're going to convince you to buy it. Okay.
I think economic conditions have lots to do with it. In times of trade depressions, the ornamental wares in a factory like Minton will be the first to go. And it would be interesting to look at the rate of decline, I would say, of ornamental wares in a factory like Wedgwood or Minton in the course of the 20th century, as a kind of index of just economic productivity and ability to survive. You know, the factories underwent, I think, in the 1880s, well, no, the 1890s of the depression, and then certainly in the 20s. The 1920s, of course, there's this huge depression. So perhaps there are all these factors, but it's interesting to speculate about taste, economics, and so forth.
But we as collectors are here to preserve for the future, and that's what's important.
Well, I think we've demonstrated that wonderfully today, I have to say. Are there any other questions?
Well,
Yes, Rebecca.
I'm interested in these techniques. We've mentioned studio pottery and how that took over in the 20th century. And there's very much a shying away from what were considered industrial techniques. And in my other life, I'm working on printed wares. And that's experiencing a huge revival in contemporary manufacturers.
Yes.
I'd be really interested to know if Majolica is being used by contemporary artists and producers, because I think that's the way forward to see where that's revisited, and that would be an interesting area.
Do you know about Jeffrey Love?
No, I don't, but yes, it'd be interesting to look at that.
Jeffrey
and
Love
that's
is a modern ceramicist who reproduces palace ware.
It's not designed.
But fantastically talented.
Christine Benet.
Are they reproductions or are they new?
They're
new
new designs.
Oh, fantastic. There you go.
But they are, they're interpretations, but they're so much like the original that they're almost not original.
They're homages.
Some of Christine Benet's are underwater palace. You know, at the bottom of the ocean kind of creatures instead of in the pond.
Christine Benet also has a wonderful book that really traces Palissy and
Doesn't she have a museum?
She has
I've
a
never done that, but her book is wonderful.
chateau. You can go to her chateau
Museum,
and
right.
stay, and it's a museum and a workshop.
Christine Benet.
Christine Benet, and she's on the internet. Yeah, you can
It's
find her.
V-I-E-N, is that right?
Well, you can find her at the Majolica International Society website. There will be a
Yes.
link under
But she started out as a gift shop. When she started manufacture, this goes back 30 years ago, she did gift wares. And then she graduated into becoming an artist, when she made some money, I guess.
Could you tell me how many serious collectors of this work are in the United States, do you think?
Which were?
Majolica and Jennifer.
What do you mean by serious?
There are many, many.
People who are obsessed.
Oh, they're all.
Obsessed is one thing, serious is another.
Well, the Majolica
I'm
Society is
just serious.
the Majolica Society is a good representation of people that are serious, but there are thousands of people who are serious who do not wish to belong to the society. So there are many, many people.
If you look at the bidding on eBay, you will also get an idea of how many people are out there who want to bid. But how many people are on the record of the Majolica Society now? 300, 200?
300 is a good number.
300 is the,
And where are they mainly from? Do you have a record? That's the kind of...
We have probably 15 members outside the United States, stretching to Australia, Canada, and Great Britain, France, and then the rest are all here in the United States.
So it could be an example of
Yeah, but then again, when I've worked with Nick, who has nothing to do with membership of the society, he sells to people that just don't want to be known.
Well, there are, I'm sorry, Joan.
No,
I mean, there are people in Russia who are collecting massive amounts of, like, Massier, which is French, you know, so they're not a member of our society.
And then there are people who, you know, are oil billionaires in the Mideast, and they're buying.
Absolutely.
They are
Absolutely.
buying the most expensive pieces, frequently.
For their institutions, or you think just for private?
They're private collections.
So what happens to all these private collections in 50 years?
The museum.
We're not going to
Are most of you going to give to museums, or are you going to put them back on the market?
Some of us
I
are.
think both. You can't give everything to a museum because museums.
They don't want it.
They don't want it.
be
So,
going in their back room.
yeah, so it's a combination.
What?
You have a question, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, who is?
No, no.
Go on.
No, I was going to make a comment.
Then make it.
No,
gonna
you
say
finish
it.
your question.
I'm not saying a word now.
My comment will end the deal.
Well, I was just curious what you think as an academic institution we could do to keep promoting Majolica. Whether, I'm not sure whether you think publication would work, whether a serious exhibition
Yes.
would work.
Very important.
A serious exhibition.
I think, well, first of all, I couldn't agree more with both of those suggestions, but it has got to be a constant pebble dropping in the pond. And we've started that relationship with the intent of doing that with BARD, and would like to continue that. Now, what shape, form, and fashion, and what sort of financial abilities and coordinations we can collaborate on may have some limitations, but talking about it and pursuing it would be absolutely wonderful.
Does anyone know of any Majolica exhibitions that are going to take place anywhere other than what we've heard here?
no.
Birmingham, Alabama has a Wedgwood, I think next summer, and they're looking at incorporating Majolica into it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she's
Who is the museum
She's trying.
in Canada?
The Gardner.
The
Gardner in Toronto.
Yeah, do they, and I've never been there to see it, but I've heard they have a big
But
collection.
that's a fantastic museum. I don't know if
It's Rachel
Majolica is
Gottlieb.
part
Who's
of it.
What's it called?
Rachel
The
Gottlieb
Gardner
is the
Gardner.
contractor.
Gardner.
The American Ceramics Circle will meet there in November.
End of October through November 2nd of this year is the American Ceramic Circle meeting at the Gardner
Yeah.
in Toronto, and that's
And
fantastic.
they do have a big collection of Majolica in.
Well, they have Majolica, and they have
They have both.
English Delftware, and the Spanish, yes.
That's not 19th century.
No,
The Plant Museum in Tampa just put on a Wedgwood exhibition which had Majolica in it. The Yale Center is putting on an exhibition of Victorian sculpture which will also have Majolica in it. The Birmingham exhibition, I have not heard a firm date. I know Anne is talking about, you know, the fall, but I don't know if it's come to fruition or not.
Ed?
What's really needed, you know, we're all sort of fluttering around the point. What's really needed is a major Majolica exhibition devoted solely to Majolica in the New York area. That's really what has been missing and has been missing for many, many years.
Since you at the museum.
Well, that was Cooper Hewitt,
Cooper
but
Hewitt,
that was
that's
David
awesome.
McFadden.
That's
But-
a
but-
long time
yeah,
ago.
But I think what you have said today, a world view, it's the world in which Majolica belongs. And there's so, when we did our book, we were limited. We knew nothing, and we only started with Minton, and that was the outgrowth. And we had a little paragraph about this country, a little paragraph, and I think the whole broad aspect with I guess the center of it is Minton, because that's where we started. But then it opens up, and we have a whole other happening with so many other people, and we are now part of a much larger world than then.
I think it gives people the opportunity, if you have an exhibition that incorporates what we've seen today, devoted to Majolica, but incorporates, as Joan said, this worldview, you give people the opportunity to express pride in their nationalism as it's represented in the decorative arts, which I think is a very strong pull toward individual collectors to associate themselves with something with which they can personally identify. That pull, that feel toward, yes, I relate to that because that's part of my history. I know that's one of the reasons that I collect. I am drawn to things that I feel a connection to. And so I think to be able to have that representation in a Majolica exhibition as exemplified by a worldview would be an incredible opportunity, in my opinion.
I have 21 garden seats in my apartment.
Do they represent 21 different nations?
I
It would be very nice also to have an internationalism spirit.
I have a Zolnay garden seat. It is one of my favorite pieces. To be able to put my Zolnay garden seat next to my Minton garden seat, next to what other country made a garden seat, wouldn't that be a wonderful display instead of all Minton Majolica? I mean, it's every country made something of the same. Let's do it.
Can I just say, talking about it being a world view, if you were to stage an exhibition here, I think it should tour. We have a space in the V&A we could maybe take it. Or maybe you could go to it. I mean, this is it.
It could travel.
There is the audience, not just in the States, but elsewhere. And I think then it would draw in the desire to bring in another audience.
Yes.
You would need.
Yeah, and if you do, please include Americans.
If you lend it to the show, then we'll take it.
Because it's great to want to do a worldwide show, but we're used to borrowing mostly from museums. We'll have to borrow from all of you.
That's right. Well, Cooper Hewitt borrowed from us. I mean, that's how they got their exhibition. We had 18 pieces. Marilyn and I lent them 18 pieces. And that was wonderful.
All
There are
right.
many different ways you could approach it. There's so many ways you could approach Majolica because it represents so many different themes. I don't think you can make a decision right now. Just think that talking about it and trying to relate it not only to the past but to the present at the same time.
Yeah.
In terms of the global thing, but also in terms of design. Some Majolica is very ahead of its time. There's some Wedgwood pieces that if you saw them, you wouldn't think they were modern. Okay? Just that comes to mind. But there's so many different ways you could approach it. The nature, the whole idea of nature, nature in this time of climate change, for example. I mean, there's so many different ways. That's part of the richness of Majolica, and that's part of the reason why we are so passionate about it, because it's not just one thing. It's many things, and you keep discovering. You just keep discovering the more you look and the more you acquire. You think you've got everything, and all of a sudden you see something and you say, oh my God, I can't believe that this is still out there. I just can't believe it.
Well,
It's so exciting.
I think that very justly is a lovely way to sum up the afternoon's proceedings. We've obviously started the germ of something in today's conference, which I'm sure will be carrying on further. Clearly, I think from an academic institution's point of view, the idea of an exhibition would be primarily to stimulate scholarship into the field and to further knowledge and so forth in the field. There's clearly much to think about and much to discuss. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank all our speakers today for an extremely stimulating and wonderful symposium. I've learned an enormous amount from everyone here. So I'd just like to say thank you so much.
To Susan, Bard Graduate Center, Andrew, all the speakers, how proud we are to have our name associated with yours.
Bravo!
And I also want to thank two people, I don't know if the other people are here or not, David and Donna Reese and Ed Flower for their support of this symposium. It wouldn't have happened without their support. And let me tell you, at least one little caveat as a collector, it is really interesting when you go to your, if you want to say this, your local museum, and you're talking to a curator in the 18th and 19th century, and they say, oh, you're a collector, and you say, oh, yes, I am, and they say, what do you collect? And you come back and you say, Majolica. And the answer is, oh, isn't that nice? So it has warmed my heart to interact with academic and people and curators who at least have told me in a very small way that we're not completely crazy. Thank you.
Thank you. And we can carry on discussion more informally outside, where there will be a small reception. Thank you.